Okay, we're going to take a look at China's Confucian Society during both the Tang and the Song Dynasty, during China's Golden Age. Let's take a quick look at the chart before we really get started. We'll see at the top there's an emperor, followed by scholars, then the gentry, then peasants, then artisans, and merchants at the bottom. Okay, so we're going to take a closer look at each one of these as we go through this. Let's start off with the emperor. Of course, the emperor, there's only one emperor, so we don't really need to spend much time about that. We should take a look, though, at the scholars. They are chosen by the Confucian exam system, so these are people that passed the exam. That would have been based on Confucian analects. They held high positions in government. They also would have come from families that could afford to educate their sons. So though ideally anybody could pass the exam or take the exam and hopefully pass it and move up the social system, in most cases you had to be well off enough to be able to study for the exams in order to be able to pass it. And many people would have spent their entire lives trying to pass this exam. Then there's the gentry. Again, these would have been wealthy landowners. Their children would have studied the Confucian classics, and as a result, because of their wealth and their emphasis on study, they most likely would have passed the exam and gone on to become civil servants working for the government of China. Then there's the peasants. Now, these are subsistence level farmers, so they're growing just enough food to feed themselves. Most of them lived in small villages. Now, Confucius doesn't put them at the bottom of the chart because in the Confucian system, peasants were valuable because they performed the necessary labor. They produced food, and without their production, there could be chaos. So peasants are a little bit higher on the chart than we normally see them in other societies. We've also got artisans, who are a small percentage of the population, but they worked at skilled trades to produce the types of goods that people would need for farming. So they might be blacksmiths, they might be carpenters, they might even be potters to create devices for storing food in. Okay, so again, a small percentage of the population. And then at the very bottom, we had merchants. Now, the merchants had lower status than peasants because their riches came from work that were done by other people. So the problem here is that Confucius didn't like merchants very much because they would seek profit, and they made profit at the expense of other people's labor. He didn't feel like they actually made anything, whereas peasants actually grow food and made things that were valuable to society. So this is a little bit hard for people that live in America in a capitalist society to understand that merchants would be at the bottom, because we tend to put merchants at the top. But in the Confucian system, merchants were really looked down upon. Now, in addition to that, though, these guys had money, and so they could buy land, and as a result, they could actually educate their children. So, in particular, their sons. So if their sons could become educated, they could eventually move up the ladder to gentry so that they could eventually become scholars. So they may be at the bottom of society, but there is the opportunity for people to move up the chart. Let's take a look at that chart. This is the organization and movement in Chinese society. And at the top is the emperor, who would either be placed there because he was the son of the previous emperor, or if he lost the mandate, he might be overthrown by a new emperor. So that doesn't happen too often that they lose the mandate. Next is the court. And these are officials over every province and country who basically are there to advise the emperor. They run everything for him. They're the government, basically. Next is the gentry. That's the scholar officials who will make up the court. And also, they're the landholders who have some wealth because they own and control land. Next are the peasants, and we'll see that they might be some village leaders there, or it might be made up of a council of elders that run the local community in which the peasants live. And then at the bottom, we have merchants. So they're at the bottom of that society. And what we do know, though, is this, is that peasants could also go to school. And in fact, anybody could take the Confucian exam. It wasn't closed off to poor people. The goal of the Confucian exam was that everybody could get an education, and government could then get the best and smartest people to work in the official gentry, right, or the official court. So they could get schooling, and then they could eventually make their way up into government service. So this is what we call social mobility, because peasants could move up the chart. You can see from peasants, they could get schooling, go to government service, and then move up the ladder and become part of what we would call the gentry class. Merchants could also do the same thing, primarily because they could make enough money through trade that they could then purchase land. If they could own land, then they could afford education for their kids. So again, merchants who were down here at the bottom of the chart could purchase land, educate their children, and as a result, their children could then move up into the gentry. Now, in both of these examples, it's going to take a couple of generations for that to happen. But this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of emphasis in learning in China, that people respect education and they work hard to get as well educated as they can because they see that as the ticket to social mobility. What moves you up and down the chart isn't necessarily how much wealth you have, it's how well educated you can become. Now, in reality, the more wealthy you were, the more time you could spend getting educated. So they kind of go together. Whereas in our society, that's not too different. We think that money is what moves us up the chart, and again, more money can get you better educated, and therefore you can move up our social ladder. Right? So, what is the level of mobility then in China? It's pretty high, and it's based on becoming educated in Confucianism. So, the key to moving ahead in society or moving up the social ladder is to become educated. All right, then, so let's take a wider look at Chinese society. First of all, let's start off with some definitions. We'll start off with this one. What's an extended family? An extended family is going to be 3 or more generations living in a single household. So that means that you have a mother, a father, and the children, and maybe the grandchildren, or the other way around. It could be grandma and grandpa with mom and dad and you. So it has to be at least 3 or more generations all living in one house. Now, this is a word that we've looked at in our class before. This is the word family. It's pronounced jia in Chinese, and it means family. It can mean home, and literally it means pig under a roof. But this is one of the most important words in Chinese language because it represents so many different things to people. Now, let me just show you a model here for family/home. This is sort of a diagram of my house. And here's my street that I live on, and I have a nice big green yard. You can see my green yard here, and I have a garage where I park my car. This is my garage, and here's my house. Okay, so in many ways, this is my jia. It's my house. It's the home in which I live in. Okay, and this is the layout of it. And this is very typical of most American homes. Right, we have our little plot of land in front of the street, and we build our house right in the middle of it. Now, this is a sort of a Chinese-style courtyard home from a traditional style home, particularly from something like maybe the Tang or the Song Dynasty, and as late as Qing Dynasty China. And you can see the layout's very different. And the street might be here. There might be a gate here in the front. Usually the gate would be blocked so that people couldn't look in. There would be an open courtyard, and then the house would surround this courtyard. And families that were well off would have multiple courtyards and much larger houses. But this might be a small, typical sort of Chinese-style home that you would have found, let's say, in the Song Dynasty. This also would have been their jia. It's where their family lived and their home. So I throw out these 2 diagrams and just show just the architectural difference in how we think about our homes and where we actually live. And the problem here is that in our society is, here's my house and here's my property. And my house is meant to be seen, but my family stays inside the house. And so the only way you can really interact with my family is you have to come into my house. So that's a little bit different than the Chinese system. In this case, the family and home's not meant to be seen. Family and home life is very private. And in this case, if you're invited into somebody's home in China, this is like a big deal because you're not just being invited into their house, which is in our case, I would invite you into my house. But in China, because of this word jia, you're actually being invited, when invited into somebody's home, to be invited into the family. That's a little bit different than what we often think about. So again, in our communities, the layout of our homes says very different things. And in the Chinese society, the layout of their homes is very different as well. Think about it. When you're being invited into somebody's house in China, you're actually being invited into their family. It's the same word. And that's why it's a very important word. And that's why when you're invited to somebody's house in China, it's a very big deal. You shouldn't take it lightly. So again, here's a typical diagram of what might have been a very well-to-do person's home in ancient China. The gate would have been up here in the front. There would have been sort of this courtyard entryway leading into the main courtyard, and then maybe the more private courtyard and the more private parts of the house in the back. So again, this might be where the patriarchal male head of the family lives, and then other members of the family, because remember, there has to be 3 or more generations living in this house, might be living in different sections of the home, depending on their status within the family. All right, here's some more terms we need to look at then. What is patriarchy? It's a term I just used a minute ago. Patriarchy means male-dominated society. So China was a patriarchal society, men dominated that society. And we know this from looking at the Confucian system, where that basically the role of men was more important than the role of women, the role of women only being that of wives. Now, China also practiced what was called patrilocality. This is when a woman gets married, she's actually going to go to live with the husband's family. So, again, it's a patriarchal society, it's male dominated, and they practice patrilocality so that women get married, they go to live with their husband's family. And then they also practice what was called patrilineal descent. And patrilineal descent is when the headship of the family is traced to the firstborn male of the firstborn male, and so on. So it's always traced from the firstborn son to the firstborn son, and it goes every generation like that. So these are the three patras that you need to be familiar with: patriarchy, patrilocality, and patrilineal descent. Okay, so let's take a quick look then at what we're going to call a Chinese or a traditional Chinese family tree. Over here, I've got the key set up for you. We're going to use a triangle to represent the male headship. We're going to use this triangle to represent males, circles to represent female, and equal sign to represent marriage. I'm just going to throw out a quick layout for you. So let's take a look at what we got here. We've got the first generation. So in this case, we've got a woman who's married to a man. This man will be the head of the family. That's why he's marked in yellow. And then they will have children. And what I will see here is that they had a son, a second son. Their third child was a girl. They had a fourth son, or a third son for a fourth child. And then we got a fifth child here who's also a girl. So they've got 3 boys and 2 girls. But the most important boy on this chart is this one, because he's the firstborn son. And as a result, he will become the head of the family. If the father were to pass away, this son becomes the new head of the family. Not the mother, but the son, because the headship is passed from the firstborn male to the nextborn male. Okay, so let's get him married as well. Now he marries this girl. Now what's interesting is this girl came from a different family, but because of patrilocality, she has left her other family and is now going to live with this family. So in many ways, she's becoming like a 6th child, like a new daughter to this family, and she will become a productive member of this family. So she's left her other family behind, and she's now going to live with this new family, the one that she just married into. Okay, let's say they have some kids, 3rd generation. All right, remember, 3 or more generations in a single household. All of these people would live in one courtyard-styled home. All right, and what I see here is that this firstborn son and his new wife basically had 3 kids, and they had 2 sons and a daughter. And in this case, the next head of the family is this 3rd generation son. So if grandpa were dead and dad died, basically all these other people who might be older than him, including uncles and aunts, they wouldn't become the head of the family. It would be passed on to this 3rd generation firstborn son. Even if it's only a small child, he becomes the head of the family. So this system becomes very complicated, but you can see here that it's the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son that becomes the head of the family. More importantly, we see that women basically have a little bit of a problem here, because when they marry into a family, they're leaving a previous family behind. They're leaving the family that they were born into behind, and they become new productive members of this family. Now, let's throw in a couple more marriages here. In this case, we've got the 3rd generation firstborn son. He gets married, so a new daughter is brought in, and this son also gets married, and he brings in a new wife. Again, all of these people would live in a single household. Okay, let's throw in some more kids. 4th generation. Now, the chances that grandma and grandpa are alive are not pretty good at this point, but if they were, by some slim chance, you would have all these people in a single home. All right, and again, we've got another firstborn son, we've got a daughter, and then these guys over here, all right, even though he's not the firstborn son, he produced a son, but he wouldn't be the head of the family. Now, they could be if they moved out and start their own family, but they're not going to do that, because what makes a family prosperous, right? Remember, Jia means, pig under the roof means that there's some level of prosperity in the home. What that means, though, is that it's to their advantage to stay in this family, because a large extended family is a family that can help each other out. And if they can help each other out, that's going to lead to the prosperity. If everybody just starts to sort of break off and go start their own homes and just live as mother, father, and children, that they won't be as prosperous as if they stay together. Remember, in ancient China, there is no such thing as social security to pay for people when they get old and retire. The way that old people, like grandma or great grandma and great grandpa up here at the chart, the only way they're going to get taken care of is if they have lots of children and grandchildren who can then take care of them in old age. So it's to your best interest to have more children, to have a large family. That's social security for them in that time period. Okay, let's take a look then at this. What we need to look at is the role of women as determined by language. Okay, because the role of women began to decline in China during the late Song dynasty. There's a lot of reasons for that. Okay, so let's take a look then at what it is. The question we want to think about is this: who's to blame for the change in status? Is it the fault of men or is it the fault of women? Because a lot of times when people address this question, they always wonder, well, is it men's fault or is it women's fault? So we're going to take a look at the role of language and how the role of language affected the role of women and how this might have affected the changes that took place. All right, let's take a look at this first word. This is a word called hao, and it's actually made up of two parts that I can see. All right, and the first part over here on the left, this is the character for woman. So usually when you see this piece here alone, it means woman. When you see this part over here, this is the character for child. So remember, it's a pictographic image, but it's made up of two radical parts. And in one case, the left-hand side means woman, and the right-hand side means child. So the definition of this word is very interesting because this is the word good in Chinese. All right, and so what's good in Chinese is a woman with a child. That's what's good. So again, even though the word means good, the characters, the pictographs, kind of have different meanings for people. So in this case, what's good is a woman with child, and in particular, a male child, not a female child. Okay, so a woman with child is good. That's our explanation. Now, let's take a look at this. You should notice there's two parts here. The bottom half should be familiar to you. That's going to be the part for woman. And this top part is what we call a radical, and that radical is the piece for roof. Okay, so it's actually pronounced an, and it's made up of two parts. It's made up of woman and roof. So it's a woman with a roof over her head. Now, the meaning of this word is the word peace. So in Chinese, the word an means peace. But if you really think about it, the real meaning of this, the explanation, could be that when a woman stays in the house, then there'll be peace. And that's one way to think about it. Again, most people in China wouldn't think this when looking at this word. They'd think the word peace, but it's made up of a woman under a roof, so a woman in the house. So when is there peace? When a woman stays in the house. Again, we've got a character with two parts. You should recognize this on the left as the character for woman again, and we've got a second radical here on the right-hand side. So this is the word yo, and what it basically means is woman with repetitive tasks. And if I put that together, what I get, this is always interesting, because a woman doing repetitive tasks, people might think of other kinds of terms that they could use for this, but the ultimate answer for this is the word for slave. And what's interesting about this word is that really it's a woman who's doing repetitive tasks, but the Chinese word for slave has woman in it, which sort of implies that being a slave is the role of the female gender. Again, people don't think this perhaps when they see the character, but it has this sort of underlying meaning to it that people should consider. So again, if I look at that traditional role of women in China based on language, I got the word good, which is a woman with child, which is good. I got peace, which is a woman who stays at home, there'll be peace. And then slave is a woman who does repetitive tasks. Three words, all of them have the component for woman in them. And they're all kind of interesting because good, peace, and slave are words that we don't often associate with gender, but in this case they are in Chinese. But I want you to think about this, is that a lot of times people will say, well, that doesn't seem very fair, or that's sexist, or why does Chinese language do that to women? They should treat women more equitably, and the language seems to be unfair. But consider this. This is the word for mother, right? In our society, it's a woman with child. That's good. Homemaker, when a woman stays at home, there'll be peace. And then this concept of slave, a woman doing repetitive tasks. And these are funny pictures because they kind of evoke memories of my own mother. My mother was a mother who, was a mother basically in the 1960s, and her life was pretty much like this. Her role was she wanted to be a mother and raise children. She wanted to stay home and, cook and clean in the house, and essentially she did all the work in the house. And so the traditional role for women in America, for some people, is sometimes seen as doing the same sorts of things. It's not too different than what we see in ancient China, that the role of women sometimes needs to change. Now, as we are now in the 2000s and the 2010s and going on, the many young ladies in the America today would probably think that the role of women needs to be different in America. But keep in mind that there are still many traditional people that think that this is the role of a woman. All right, and it's not too different than what the Chinese expectation is in their own language. So we want to be careful not to be too quick to judge the Chinese for what appears to be the bias or the inequality that's inherent in their culture, that it's not fair for women to live in that kind of a society that's patriarchal society that does patriarchality and does also patrilineal descent, when it's not too different in our own society. So let's take a look at that question again. The role of women determined by language, and the question was, who is to blame for the change in status, men or women? Now in class we often discuss this, and there'll be some people that say it's men's fault, and in other cases people will say it's women's fault. But here's the actual answer. The answer is both men and women are to blame. If we're going to assign blame, which we probably shouldn't, we need to blame both. And the reason why we need to blame both is that both genders speak the same language. This inequality isn't about men or women, it's about language. And if the language has an inherently built-in bias against women, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It matters if you speak the language. And if you speak that language, it is going to have sexism built into the language. And so what has to change is the way in which we use the language. So consider this. In our own society, we all know the word policeman, fireman, and mailman. But if you think about it, they all have the word man in them. All right, which kind of implies that only a man could be a police officer, or only a fireman could fight fires, or only a man could deliver mail. But we could easily change those to police officer, to firefighter, or mail carrier. And these terms are gender neutral, and it also makes it possible so that women could also be employed in those same occupations. So again, it's really easy to look back at the Chinese and be critical of their language and their cultural practices in regards to women and equality. But don't forget, in our own society, we still have these very sort of traditional roles for women, and inherently built into our language are some sexist terms that we often don't think about. So as a young man, I remember very well when these terms were considered sort of outrageous. But as we move into the future, I think it's important that we understand that if women are going to be treated equitably in any society, you have to start by reforming the language by which we use to communicate about the equality and rights of both men and women.